Thanks for joining us. We begin our show with that tough sell in Bahrain this week. President Donald Trump's son-in-law and senior advisor Jared Kushner reached out to Palestinians and tried to convince them to consider a $50 billion economic support plan, even though they already rejected the proposal and boycotted the event. So, was it a failure, as many said it would be? Let's ask my guest today. I'm very happy to welcome back to the Spin Room former U.S. Ambassador to Israel, Dan Shapiro. And also joining us is Counsel to Republicans overseas in Israel, Abe Katzman. And from our studios in Washington, D.C., the president of the Arab American Institute, Dr. James Zogby. Thank you all for coming on the show. Ambassador, I'd like to start with you. Many people had low expectations for this, if it was politicians, pundits, the public, diplomats, or former diplomats. Now that we've seen what happened, we saw what was there, were those people right? Was it a failure?
I'm not sure it was a failure, but it was almost a non-event in this sense. It laid out some reasonable economic ideas, housing, infrastructure, employment, and the like, which have been part of previous economic plans. But the sponsoring body, the United States, has withdrawn all of our U.S. assistance to Palestinians over the last year and a half. So our credibility to ask others to invest in it is low. But the bigger problem is that it's not attached to any political vision. Previous economic plans have been attached to trying to implement a two-state solution. And absent that knowledge of what's the backdrop that countries and companies would be asked to invest in, I think very few actual dollars will materialize for this until that plan is spelled out.
James, I'll go over to you now. How will this conference go down in history, do you think?
As a wipeout, I think a bit of a vanity performance for Jared Kushner. And for the Arab side, it was a box check, a risky box check. But they need the United States. They need the alliance with the United States. And they were loath to say no. For Palestinians, it'll be less than a blip. And I think that there were no expectations going into it. And from everything I've seen, there was really nothing coming out of it, and so essentially it was a fairly expensive waste of time.
Abe, before we go for a break, another minute we have. How do you think this conference will go down in history?
I think it's a little too soon to write history about it, but I actually think that these views are a little bit pessimistic, because I think that what you've actually seen is looking at this from the outside, creating an opportunity for the Palestinians themselves. It's the Palestinian Authority leadership, which is barely accountable, if at all, that's rejected it. The people haven't. They've wanted to attend, and if they have a stake in prosperity, maybe they have a stake that they will that they'll follow up on in terms of actually accepting some kind of peaceful solution. The situation will change. It can change the it can change the dynamics.
Okay, we have to go for a commercial break, and when we come back, more with my guests on the economic workshop in Bahrain and what's next. When will the political part of the deal of the century be revealed? That's up next. Stick around. We're back on the Spin Room with Ambassador Dan Shapiro, Abe Katzman, and James Zogby in Washington, D.C., still discussing the Bahrain Economic Workshop, which took place this week. Ambassador, I want to go back to you and get your response to something that was written in Haaretz by their analyst, Anshel Pfeffer. He wrote in his op-ed during the conference that the Bahrain gathering is still important. For the first time, official representatives of a significant number of Sunni Arab states will be openly attending an international conference on resolving the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians. They will be doing so against the express wishes of the Palestinians and not one of the cardinal Palestinian demands. Statehood, Jerusalem, borders, refugees will be on the conference's official agenda. Would you agree, Ambassador, that despite all the low expectations that we talked about before, this was a rare event of people from around the region coming together and just organizing it and holding it was an achievement in itself?
It is not without some meaning. There were Israeli business people, although no Israeli officials. That was notable, that Arab governments didn't feel comfortable having Israeli officials attend, with the Palestinians having chosen not to attend. But some Israeli business people did, and they did have meetings, and they were treated well, and there were perhaps theoretical discussions about eventual business. I don't think we will probably see any real deals emerge from them, but at least it was friendly. Certainly the Bahrain foreign minister gave an interview with an Israeli journalist in which he said some very generous things to Israel, which is a positive thing to hear that type of breaking down of walls. I think all of that, though, is low-hanging fruit, and the bigger test is what would happen when the political part of the U.S. plan comes out. If it's not consistent with the parameters of a two-state solution as we've previously understood it, I suspect a lot of those Arab governments won't go any further. They may even take a step back rather than be exposed for, as it would be understood by their publics, abandoning the Palestinian cause.
James, I'd like to get your reaction to that op-ed that I just quoted. Would you admit that there is some truth to what Anshel Pfeffer is writing, that maybe the conference, okay, it won't bring peace, but it is in itself an achievement?
No. Listen, you have to have no historical memory at all to have written something like that. What was Madrid? I was present at the, I chaired one of the sessions at the Casablanca International Summit that followed Oslo. And I remember very, very distinctly Israelis being there in an Arab country looking for any Arab guy in a thobe to run up and get a picture taken. This is in the pre-selfie era, 1994, but they had somebody with a camera snapping shots so they could say, I was here in the Arab world. Palestinians signing Oslo opened the door to the Arab world for Israel. Israel went in. But in the follow-up to Casablanca, in Amman, the borders were closed. And so the Israelis went, the Arab world went, businessmen from everywhere were there, but the Palestinians weren't allowed to cross because this was in the post-massacre in Hebron era, and Rabin had closed the borders. Then there was Annapolis, when again Arabs and Israelis sat down together at the invitation of George Bush. So it's not a first time. In fact, it was a very low-level performance on the part of everybody. I mean, the Arabs did not send major government people. In large part, and the Israelis weren't invited, in large part because there is, at this present time, no Arab leader who wants to do a public event with the Israelis in this setting, given the attitudes that currently exist. And so, look, I understand the needs in the Arab world of protection from what they feel is an aggressive Iran, and Iran is, in fact, a very meddlesome player in the region, concerned about extremism. They would like to see a comprehensive arrangement in the region that could confront these challenges. But at this present time, for the Trump administration to push people together in this way puts them more at risk than it provides them with security. And the Palestinians have been the pawns in all of this. And I think it's unfair and patronizing for Jared Kushner to be blaming them for their economic problems, when in fact the best way to end the economic problems of Palestinians is in the occupation.
Abe, I want your reaction to that, and also show you a quote from The Guardian, written by Martin Chulov, an op-ed written by Martin Chulov, says that in the end the deal of the century was little more than a failed clearance sale. Jared Kushner arrived in Bahrain touting bedrock principles at untenable discounts, and even then there were no buyers. You know, without that second political half, the economic proposal is essentially meaningless. I mean, why would anyone invest billions of dollars in infrastructure or transportation projects in the West Bank and Gaza when things on the ground, when the violence continues?
Because it's a step in the right direction in order to get the violence to not continue. Look, with all due respect, it's not 1994 anymore. It's not 2004 anymore. You've got a much different dynamic than you had then. And in fact,
you had the Second Intifada, for example. It got bloody.
And if you had the I'm sorry, you're dealing with something a lot different. And the fact that you don't have, I find it interesting that, for instance, the Palestinian Authority has gone so overboard in protesting, burning Donald Trump in effigy, carrying the coffin around that for the Bahrain conference. Why? I ask why. And I think the answer is, it's not that they're afraid, that they think it's meaningless and they think it won't work. It's that they're afraid that it will. Otherwise, why react this way?
Ambassador, what happens if no one buys into this plan, even the political part afterwards? I mean, how do you think this administration, this Trump administration, is going to react? Will it ratchet up the pressure on the Palestinians even more?
They may. What worries me is the following scenario, that they'll issue a plan sometime after the Israeli election. It's clear they're not going to issue a political plan before there's an Israeli government. And the plan will be something that is so one-sided that is essentially confirming the status quo as the permanent status, isolated islands of limited Palestinian autonomy surrounded by annexed Israeli settlements, with the theoretical promise of a lot of investment based on this Bahrain conference. The Palestinians, of course, will not accept that. I think most of the Arab world will not accept that. And at that point, the administration may throw up their hands and sort of green light Israeli annexation of the West Bank, or at least Area C of the West Bank. That, to me, is a scenario that worries me. I don't know that's where they're headed, but if you put the pieces of the that are up on the board together, based on various statements made by various administration officials, it feels like that's the flow of events.
James, I want to get your idea about the flow of events. I mean, can you see a situation, for example, in the future where frustration, frustration grows on the Palestinian street, even with its own leadership, and with the Trump administration, and with the Israelis, and then take to the streets in maybe an intifada style of response?
Look, I have no idea what the future will bring, but what I do know is that as we look further down the road than whatever might occur in the next 4, 5, 6 years, I see a one-state reality, and I see Jared Kushner, if his plan is implemented, and I actually have just written a piece telling the Palestinians, take the money and run. He could be the father of the one state in Israel-Palestine. Economic empowerment, why not? Building infrastructure, why not? At some point, people will say political rights and equal rights and the right to run for office, why not? The issue is, if Israel wants to be secure, end the occupation. What's different between today and 1994 are there are 600,000+ settlers in the West Bank. There are roads carving the West Bank into little pieces. Dan is right. You got little cantons there. It is not sustainable. I don't know if it erupts, but what I do know is that I've seen nothing from the Trump administration in any way imaginative or principled enough to resolve the current crisis that we're in.
Okay.
And that is something I find very distressing.
Abe, you want to that?
Yeah, the take the money and run idea is interesting, except that the Palestinian Authority is calling any businessman that participates a collaborator, and that's a pretty serious charge for the Palestinian Authority to make, considering their record against so-called collaborators. Now, I think the problem here is that it kind of shows how irrelevant they are, and quite honestly, I think the fact that they're boycotting this is the best thing that could happen to it, because the Palestinian Authority, for all intents and purposes, is a mafia that happens to have control of a government. And at a business meeting, if the mafia doesn't show up at the table, maybe the legitimate businesses have a chance of getting something done.
I'm going to let James respond to that. Looks like you want to say something. Go ahead, James.
Yeah, listen, it's insensitive and bizarre to make a comment like that. These are people living under a horribly repressive occupation. The Palestinian Authority did not force people not to come. I spoke with Palestinian business leaders who are themselves far more influential in the West Bank than the Palestinian Authority. They are not going. They weren't going. They refused to participate in this because they're furious at the policies of the Trump administration. Do not blame the Palestinian authorities. That's blaming the victim.
Ambassador,
the Palestinians are living under an occupation. That's the problem.
I want to get your response, Ambassador, something that U.S. Middle East Envoy Jason Greenblatt said yesterday in Bahrain. Said that he has never had any reason to criticize Prime Minister Netanyahu or the Israeli government for their policies towards Palestinians. What's your response to that?
Obviously, he's reflecting the views of his government and his boss. I worked for an administration that did have differences with the Israeli government and felt that our relationship was strong enough that we could express those differences. It didn't make us less good allies or less good partners or less committed to Israel's security or less committed. In fact, sometimes it was because of our commitment to helping Israel achieve a two-state solution with the Palestinians, avoiding the one-state outcome, the binational reality that Israeli leaders say they want to avoid. So when there are differences, I think in a close alliance, they can be expressed. Obviously, if he doesn't have any to express, that's his government's policy.
The U.S. election is getting more intense. We're getting closer. You've been on the U.S. mediating teams before. What happens to mediation efforts when the politics back home starts to shift gears?
Well, one thing that happens in the region is that people start to count down to American elections. They can look at the calendar, and they tend to try to wait out an administration that is pursuing a policy they don't think they're going to be able to support. I think this Bahrain summit, as modest as it was, may end up being the high point in the sense that by the time the Israeli election is passed and the administration might consider putting out a plan, we will be within less than a year of the U.S. election. President Trump will be heavily focused on that. He'll have to weigh the politics of whether it's helpful to put out a plan that may fail or may produce violence. And indeed, parties in the region may say, you know what, we just can't really invest in this because time is running out.
James, a quick answer from you. How do you see this conflict, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, playing out in the race for the White House? Will it be more prominent than it has in earlier races?
Well, I don't know how prominent, but it will certainly be there. There's a demographic divide in the country with young people, African Americans, Latinos, Asians, educated women on one side, and white, middle-class, middle-aged, born-again Christians on the other side. Those are the base votes of the Democratic and Republican parties. There's a clear split. We saw it play out in previous elections, and I think it'll be there again. I think that you'll see Democrats playing to their base by being far more balanced and expressing far more sympathy with Palestinians than you would have seen in previous elections, for sure.
30 seconds to you. Wrap it up. How do you think it's going to play out?
I think there's probably some accuracy in that. I think it is dangerous, the trend that is going on. You might even call it the Corbynization of the Democratic Party. I wish it were bipartisan. The problem with Israel as an issue is that it becomes a political football. And if the two sides are playing on different teams, not good for Israel.
Okay, political football. We'll have to end it at that. I'd like to thank my guests.
Netanyahu to thank for that.
You have Netanyahu to thank for that. Okay, that's James Zogby there. I want to thank my guests, Ambassador Dan Shapiro, James Zogby, and Abe Katzman. Thank you very much for coming on the show.